Hello everyone, I'm Christelle and tonight we will be discussing about a certain Thomas. And not this Thomas, but this Thomas, Mr. Thomas Hobbes. You've already heard of him when we were discussing about Lord of the Flies, when we were debating, or probably in your undergraduate classes, in your social science classes, and philosophy classes in the undergrad. In this session, we will discuss his philosophies, his greatest work, and who he is as a person or as a human being. So, with that, let's get started. Thomas Hobbes lived from 1588 to 1679 in England, so he was 91 years old when he died. At this period, Europe is in great political and social turmoil. There was the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, the Puritan Revolution from 1642 to 1649, and the English Civil Wars. When the Parliament tried to assert its authority in 1640, Hobbes was one of the first who fled because his writings up to that point were anti-parliamentarian and anti-democratic. When he fled to France, he tutored Charles II, the son of the executed monarch Charles I. So we've seen that he lived through multiple wars throughout his lifetime. So it's understandable that he grew weary of wars and he wants to have world peace. So he formulated a worldview that is reflected to his greatest work, the Leviathan. The Leviathan, or the matter, form, and power of commonwealth, ecclesiastical and civil, was published in 1651. Leviathan is considered the first general theory of politics written in the English language, and with this, Hobbes became one of the founding fathers of modern political thought, paving the way for philosophers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The Leviathan is an allusion to a great sea monster depicted in the Bible, and used that image to demonstrate the power of the body politic where citizens unite under a sovereign leader. The head symbolizes the sovereign leader, while the body symbolizes the people who have joined the creature to or for the protection and peace. This literature is divided into 4 parts, namely of man, of commonwealth, of Christian commonwealth, and of the kingdom of darkness. Of man. So, in Hobbes' philosophy, men are naturally equal in mind and body. In his argument as to the strength of the body, even the weakest has enough strength to kill the strongest, either by slaying him secretly or by allying with others with the same agenda. As for the mental faculties, Hobbes says that we have even greater natural equality because he argues that prudence is a matter of time and experience that can be acquired by everybody. Most people think that they have more wisdom or intelligence compared to their fellow men, but according to Hobbes, that is proof that we are more equal rather than unequal. For him, this basic equality of men is the principal source of trouble and misery. Since men have equal faculties, men also have similar hopes and dreams. And since the world is limited, when 2 men desire the same thing which they cannot obtain without depriving the other, they become enemies and seek to destroy each other. Now, in the state of nature, according to Hobbes, our natural equality, men will be in a condition of war of every man against every man in the state of nature. In the state of nature, there is no place for industry, agriculture, navigation, trade, arts or letters, and society, and the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Hobbes cited the savage people in the many places of America, which has no government and live in the matter as described. Note that at the time of Hobbes, the Englishmen recently discovered the United States of America, or the Americans. However, based on anthropological data that we have today, we know that life is actually more regulated in the so-called primitive groups than what Hobbes envisioned with the state of nature. Since Hobbes is an individualist, he is unaware that the family or clan is the basic social unit in so-called primitive societies, and custom or social pressure, and not law, is its mechanism to enforce conformity. Remember, the main sources of law includes legislation, precedents, and customs. Fear of death. In the state of nature, people will have this constant fear of death, which would make them lean towards peace. When men realize that their constant fear of death is due to the brutal competition in the state of nature, reasonably, man would accept the principle of not doing something to another which thou thinkest unreasonable to be done by another to yourself, or we are all familiar with the Confucius Golden Rule. However, for Thomas Hobbes, the Golden Rule is insufficient. Even if man has the capacity to follow it for fear of death, man's desire for power and glory may tempt him to break his pledge unless there is a restraining power strong enough to keep him into his promise, because covenants without the sword are but words and of no strength to secure a man at all. So according to Hobbes, a sovereign authority must be created to whom all power is transferred. The social contract. The social contract is made between the subject and the subject, not the subject and the sovereign. By participating in the creation of the sovereign, the subject is the author of all that the ruler does and must therefore not complain of any of the ruler's actions, because he would then be deliberately doing injury to himself. Hobbes concedes that the sovereign may commit impropriety, but not injustice or injury in the proper signification, because he cannot, by definition, act illegally. He determines, or the sovereign determines, what is just and unjust, and his action is the law. Of the Commonwealth. The best form of state according to Hobbes. According to Hobbes, the best form of state is not one of logic, but of the convenience of the aptitude of the state to produce the security and peace of the people for which a government is instituted. So for Hobbes, the best form of state is monarchy, because it suffers relatively less from the competition for office and power. It is easier for one than many to act resolutely and consistently. So, does Thomas Hobbes agree on separation of powers? Thomas Hobbes vehemently opposes the division of powers or mixed government. He says there wouldn't be civil wars in England if it weren't for the widespread belief that sovereignty was divided between kings, lords, and commons. It is also dangerous for the sovereign, according to him, if the subject has the liberty to challenge the wisdom of legality of the sovereign's actions. So the poisonous doctrine that every private man is a judge of good and evil actions, and that whatsoever a man does against his conscience is sin. Now to avoid that, Hobbes demands the unqualified obedience of the subject. Now how about the separation of church and state? More like the subordination of church to the state. According to Hobbes, he is anxious to prevent churches from interfering in any way with the activities of the state. So, in his doctrine, the church becomes a department of the state. He reminds the religious that the safety of the church depends on the state and not the other way around. Is civil law inferior to law of nature? Hobbes rejects this approach that the civil law is inferior to the law of nature. So he rejects this approach to the problem of the validity of law on the ground that it places validity beyond the formal source of the legal sovereign. He lists equity, justice, gratitude, and other moral virtues as the laws of nature. These qualities are not true laws because before the state is established, there is no authority to decide finally which idea of the law is binding. In practice, therefore, the law of nature is nothing but a set of general principles of civil law. He pointed out that the main formal difference lies in the fact that civil law is written, whereas natural law is unwritten. Hobbes' view on good and evil. According to Hobbes, good and evil are not ethical qualities of an object or action, but merely expressions of an individual's feelings about them. So to him, I quote, "But whatsoever is the object of any man's appetite or desire, that is it which he is for his part calls good. And the object for his hate and aversion, evil. And for his contempt, vile and inconsiderable." For these words of good, evil, and contemptible are ever used with the relation of the person that uses them, there being nothing simply and absolutely so, nor any common rule of good and evil to be taken from the nature of the objects themselves. So to recap, Thomas Hobbes is an advocate to the absolute power of the state over its citizens, to address the constant wars and the fear of death that came from the state of nature. Now there is the social contract that implies that the people consented to whatever their ruler would do because they took part in the creation of such social contract. Also, his philosophy, or Thomas Hobbes' philosophy, is hinted in our 1987 Constitution, particularly in the Article 2, Section 4, which states that the prime duty of the government is to serve and protect the people. Now that is all for Thomas Hobbes. I hope you learned something, and see you again next time. Bye!